As I mentioned this morning, the former Supreme Allied Commander Europe, General Phil Breedlove, who lives in the Tampa area, needed to stay behind because of the hurricane. The airports were closed, and he needed to take care of his family. And so we unfortunately lost General Breedlove, but we are delighted and honored that among our guests here we had Ambassador Dan Fried. And Ambassador Fried has kindly agreed to take this slot. Now I'm going to have a seat here. We're just going to have a conversation for half an hour or so. And I hope that we can touch on many of the issues and themes that have already come up. And I do look forward to opening the floor to some questions as well, so be thinking about those. Now, in full disclosure, I need to tell all of you that I worked for Ambassador Fried effectively as his deputy for 7 years, for 4 of those years at the National Security Council. When Dan became Assistant Secretary for Europe, I became the acting Senior Director for Europe at the National Security Council until he brought me over to be the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Europe at the State Department. And I played that role working for Dan. At one point, he became the acting Undersecretary of State, and I became the acting Assistant Secretary for Europe. And then we reverted back to where we were. And then, with Dan's blessing, I went to NATO as the U.S. ambassador for a year. And Dan was, in fact, one of my first visitors when I was there as ambassador after the outbreak of fighting in Georgia, and one of my first visitors after President Obama took office. So we go back a long way, and we've stayed in touch and have remained great friends over the years. And that's telling you what my relationship with Dan Fried has been. But let me tell you a little bit about his career as well, too. Dan left the U.S. Foreign Service after 40 years as an American diplomat in February of this year. He had served as Assistant Secretary for European Affairs, Senior Director for Europe at the National Security Council, Ambassador to Poland, and in his most recent incarnations, a critical, functional officer within the State Department, dealing with sanctions policy generally, which includes sanctions on Russia because of Ukraine, or Magnitsky, or sanctions dealing with North Korea, or Iran. He dealt with Guantanamo detainees, seeing their placement in other countries. He dealt with the MEK, which was a terrorist group in Iraq that was then itself under severe physical threat, and seeing them move to safety away from one area in northern Iraq to the Baghdad airport. So Dan has had an extraordinary career that spans a lot of different issues. When we worked together, one of the critical things we did was working on the idea of a Europe whole, free, and at peace. And I remember in particular when I arrived at the National Security Council, responsible for NATO issues, and Dan said, "What do we do?" And I had this long list of ideas. Well, NATO needs to do this and this and this and this. And Dan said, "Yeah, but what do we do?" and it was particularly about enlargement. And he had just written the Warsaw speech that President Bush gave in Warsaw, where he talked about security and freedom and democracy for all European peoples from the Baltic to the Black Sea. And that became the project that we worked on the most together, especially after 9/11, 16 years ago. And it led to the Prague summit, where 7 countries joined NATO, and the follow-through on that, which has now been Albania, Croatia, Montenegro. And quite frankly, this is a process that I don't believe is over. And I'm sure that most of you don't believe it's over as well. So Dan, the first thing I'm going to ask you now, I've talked a lot just to set the stage, but the first thing I'd like to ask you is this project of a Europe whole and free and at peace, which has been a guiding light in your career and on which we did that rarest of things as diplomats, actually accomplish something. Where do you see that project now, and where does it go from here?
One of the traps of being a policymaker is to overestimate what you can achieve in the short run, which usually means this year or in the second term of whatever president you're working for. Usually get that wrong. But the second mistake is that we usually underestimate what we can achieve in the long run. So I'm thinking of the Baltic states. If there was one thing I was taught in university, it was that the Baltic states would never be free of Soviet domination. That was certain. And we had to be realistic about the fact that it was all over. And so it reduced Baltic independence to captive nations week and kind of cynical events with Baltic Americans, until all of a sudden the unthinkables became the inevitable. And that was a profound lesson. Don't underestimate what you can achieve in the long run, but don't try to oversell what you can achieve right now, which is a lot easier to articulate as a principle than it is to put into practice. So, okay, we're in Georgia. Let's apply it to Georgia. Don't write a policy memo. I would advise the next Assistant Secretary for Europe, about how you're going to get Georgia into the Europe whole, free, and at peace. Don't write that memo about how you're going to do it immediately. But don't allow any memo to be written which shuts off that possibility. History has a way of exceeding your expectations when you least expect it. And that was also the lesson of 1989. Like, nobody believed that we would achieve what we achieved. Some of you knew Bronisław Geremek, the Solidarity intellectual, later the Lech Wałęsa's negotiator in 1989 and Polish foreign minister. He told me the last time I saw him, as a foreign minister, I can say that this or that is completely unacceptable. But as a historian, I know that it doesn't matter what I say is unacceptable. Stuff happens beyond our control. So that is my theoretical answer. The project of Europe whole, free, and at peace had a fabulous 20-year run. For 10 years or 9 years, it's been paused, not entirely. Montenegro getting into NATO, Montenegro's accession to NATO was a big deal because it showed that we were serious. But let's be honest, okay? It's been on pause, but things can change in most unexpected ways. Georgia needs to keep that in mind and be aggressive pursuing what it can pursue, and be patient in pursuing its objectives, but don't give up the objectives. But don't listen to me. Ask our Lithuanian friends, they've been there. They were where the Georgians are now, that's exactly where they were in 1997. All right, so that's my answer. Okay. And the weather is bad, but it will not always be bad.
Another way to tackle this question is to think about what's different now from 1997, 1999, 2002. One of the things that's different is we have even more inward-looking Europe than we had then. We have a United States that's going through a populist challenge to the status quo. We have that also in Europe. We have a Russia that is not willing to reconcile with the fate of its neighbors, the aspirations of its neighbors, in ways that Russia was willing to do with the Warsaw Pact countries and even the Baltic states back then. So those are all factors that make it harder. How do you see the interplay of those factors when you look into the future?
Well, you're right. Compared to 20 years ago, America is more inward-looking. America and Europe are more inward-looking. The Russians are worse. They're stronger and more aggressive. And the The third variable are the aspirant countries themselves. Georgia and Ukraine, first among them. The things that the Georgians and Ukrainians can best control is the pace of their own reforms. And that's what they have to work on, as well, obviously, as working on the NATO agenda and relations with the US. But Poland in its time, and the Baltic states in their time, generated their own political capital, which then we could use, right? I mean, Poles used to say, thank you for getting us into NATO. I didn't get them into NATO. They got themselves into NATO because they did the hard work. And had they failed, I wouldn't accept the blame. Georgia it's a small country with a very large enemy, but it is still free. It has some agency, it has some choice. The stronger its reforms, the more political capital its friends have. That's especially true with Ukraine, where Ukraine is resisting Russian aggression on the ground, but let us say, not fulfilling its potential at home.
Right.
They need to fix that. And there's a good dynamic at work. If the Ukrainians do their job, they prove that the model of enlarging the free world still works. And that's not just words, that's real. And by the way, of all the world's kind of awful, insolvable problems, Ukraine is the one that is the most solvable with the greatest possibility of a successful conclusion, by which I define Russia failing, Ukraine succeeding. Not too much pressure on you, Kurt, but if Russia fails in Ukraine, and Ukraine becomes a Europeanizing, democratizing country, that is a huge blow to Putinism, and it will also help Georgia a lot.
Yeah. Maybe another way to think of it is that if Ukraine succeeds now, that can keep the door open for Russia to succeed later.
Well,
in a different way.
If Ukraine succeeds, I think that many Russians will look at Kyiv, a pravoslavny, Russian-speaking city, and think, if they're Europeanizing, why can't we?
Right.
Why are we being prevented from this future?
Right. And this opens up a question then. I'm pretty confident the U.S. will right the boat. We'll come back to that. I'm pretty confident that Europe still believes in Europe. The most interesting thing is after President Putin orchestrates his re-election next spring, and I think we all have very high confidence in his ability to do so, then the parlor game starts. Now what? And it's a 6-year-long parlor game, so maybe you can kick it down the road a little bit. How do you see Russia evolving after spring of next year?
Oh, boy. Okay, so there are two camps of Russia watchers. One are people, well, the third camp are the Russian stooges, the people that are bought. So let's not count them. But two camps of Russia watchers. Some people believe the Russians will always be civilizationally inferior, that they're really Asiatic, they will never be democratic, the tradition of the czars is so strong, Putin is the best they can do ever. I don't believe that.
No way.
I believe that Russia is as capable as any other country of achieving a European future. It's harder for them. They're in a terrible place right now, but I don't think they're civilizationally doomed. All the more do I blame Putin, because the Russians do have a choice. Look, right now, it's just awful. The chauvinism, the historical blindness, they all believe this stuff. However, we all thought they believed, if not in communism, at least supported the Soviet worldview, and it turned out not to be the case. I think we're now in a position, the West is in a position where we should not be too creative with respect to Russia. And by creative, I mean we shouldn't constantly come up with plans and ideas as if they were flowers to throw at the feet of the Russians.
Right.
This is not a creative period. That period may come, in which case I'm all for being creative. But for now, it's like the early 1980s after the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, the late Brezhnev period, zastoy, as it's called, the period of stagnation. Don't be in a hurry to be creative. Let the Russians stew. We're the stronger power. Let's act like it. Yeah. And keep the Russians off, help the Georgians, help the Ukrainians. Do not give an inch and wait for better days.
Yeah. Dan, as Assistant Secretary in his other jobs, had a lot of fantastic sayings. He used to close every staff meeting by saying, "Be careful out there,"
yeah.
which was a reference to the Hill Street Blues, an American television show that ended those staff meetings the same way. Another one, which had a great currency, was "Only the paranoid survive."
Right.
And another one, which is relevant to what you just said now, and about creativity in diplomacy. You used to say about negotiations that I'm willing to give away anything except what I want.
Well, okay, but I stole that line. That was Abraham Lincoln's strategy as a lawyer, to give away everything except what he needed to win the case. Right?
But that's
always
important
steal from Lincoln. You can do worse. Can't do better.
There is in that comment then a place for some creativity, as long as you know what you want.
When I said don't be too creative, what I meant was don't take the initiative in coming up with plans to improve relations with Russia unless you think they're ready. Because then you end up throwing bouquets at their feet. And when they're not ready, they're not ready. And when the Russians are ready to do a deal, they know how to move. Their diplomats are actually very good. If you work with them when they want to settle something, they're smart, creative, flexible. They can find different ways to accommodate lots of interests. It's like dealing with a whole other country. It's just wonderful. We shouldn't be in too much of a hurry. We shouldn't be impatient. Now, that is not a remark directed at your current mandate, your other job, right? Good luck with that, but if the Russians are seriously exploring a UN peacekeeping mandate inside, we should welcome the exploration. My view, not in too much hurry, to allow the Russians to set term for UN peacekeepers on the sovereign territory of another nation. But that's just me. You'll do your job. I remember Secretary Kerry always coming up with new ways to work with the Russians on Syria. Lavrov didn't want to work with us on Syria, except on his terms. So stop asking him. Stop asking him. Figure out a position of strength, and then the time will come. But we'll see what there is. It's been publicly reported, and I won't put Bridget Brink on the spot. It has been publicly reported that the Trump administration's Russia policy is in an advanced state of development. I have not seen it. I have not been briefed on it. But what I have heard is that it's a perfectly reasonable and balanced policy. The pillar of resist Russian aggression, the pillar of look for areas of cooperation. Yeah, good luck with that. Пожалуйста, go ahead. And then something about stabilizing the relationship. I mean, that's a perfectly reasonable policy. I'm just saying that right now the emphasis is going to be on the first pillar. And we shouldn't be impatient with the fact that Russia is not going to be cooperative. But we should never close the door ultimately to cooperation, because I believe Russia could turn a corner.
Right. Okay, now this opens up. Let's take the advanced state of something, which is how does Russia play in the U.S. domestic context?
Oh,
What's
God.
going on?
How should I know? Am I Bob Mueller? Look, the disadvantage we all have is that there is an unknown out there, a big black box called, labeled the relationship between the Trump organization / campaign / family / individual with Russia. And not you, not I, not anybody in this audience knows what it is. So that's one problem. Let's put that aside. There are two other levels of weirdness about about this president and Russia. One is the ideological affinity. And that's not unique to Donald J. Trump. It is a common problem among a small but growing part of the American right, and a larger part of the European right, the hard right, the nationalist right, not the Christian democratic right. They like Putin because they see in him a defender of some version of the West. I mean, the West minus the Enlightenment, which to me is not the West, but ask them what they mean. And Bannon shared that view. It's just astonishing to me. Somebody who's so anti-European takes the worst European ideas from the middle of the last century and thinks that it's original. I mean, that's just nuts. The remake is not as good as the original, and the original wasn't much good. So that's one weird thing that's going on. Mm-hmm. The other weird thing is that operationally, the Russians got inside our system before we knew it. Like, we think of Russian propaganda, we think of RT. Well, RT is not the issue. We've woken up to the fact that the Russian system was using troll farms and bot factories and buying influence and was much deeper in our systems, all of ours, Georgia, Europe, the United States, than we realized. And we have barely begun, we've just started thinking about how to combat it. So there's the ideological component, there's the propaganda component, and then there's the black box.
Yeah. Well, on the waking up late to the interference, I think that's generally true about Russia, not just about interference in the election.
Well,
I mean, think about the 2012 presidential debate where Romney was ridiculed for suggesting that Russia was an adversary.
Okay, so in Russia, and this came up before, it was in the first panel, I would say that assessing Bush and Obama's policy toward Russia, I would say that both failed to understand Russia, but neither made a dirty deal on the basis of that failure to understand Russia, by which I mean Bush thought he could do more business with Putin than it turned out to be possible, and so did Obama. Bush had more reason. Obama shouldn't have made the mistake, but both of them understood their error and took steps to correct it. Bush did late. Well, Bush understood Putin reasonably early, but after the Georgian War, when we should have done more to counter Russia, we were out of time and out of steam. Obama realized his mistake of underestimating Putin's aggressive nature until after the invasion of Ukraine, at which point he backed sanctions and, irony of ironies, led NATO to put forces into the Baltics and brigade. There are now 2 American brigades in Poland, which was unthinkable 10 years ago under Bush. So both presidents got Russia wrong, but there was no strategic catastrophe. Now we'll see.
Mm-hmm. Well, and to remind again, so Bush did this after Russia reached out to the U.S. after 9/11.
Sure, he had a reason.
Obama did this after Russia invaded Georgia.
That's right. Like I said, Bush had more reason to make an optimistic assessment of Russia. Obama had less reason. But I want to defend Obama because the real strategic catastrophe is not simply wasting your time with the Russians. The strategic catastrophe would be doing a dirty deal over the heads of the Ukrainians or the Georgians. Okay, let's be blunt. That's the catastrophe. It would be, you know, you can if you help us on North Korea or Syria or wherever, you can have Ukraine. That would be a national disgrace. And neither president did that. They were wrong, but they were honest.
Yeah. Now, one of the weirdnesses that you left out was the effort still to delegitimize Trump and the use of Russia as a tool in that effort. And I think that is one of the reasons why we now have 98 senators voting for sanctions on Russia, when any other time it would have been Republicans in favor, Democrats against, and it shifted. But that also means I wonder how fleeting that shift will be once the effort to delegitimize is past its peak.
Oh, boy. Well, that is an interesting political question. The Democrats and the American center-left has rediscovered its inner, what I call, Cold War liberal. That is, before Vietnam, there was a wing of the Democratic Party which was staunchly anti-communist and believed in defending Europe against the Soviet and communist threat. That's Harry Truman, but also a little bit Eleanor Roosevelt. And and if you think of Dick Holbrooke or Ron Asmus, they were the carriers of that part of the Democratic Party. Ron Asmus getting sick when he did was awful because the Obama administration would have benefited enormously from his strategic vision. But now, because of Putin and the hacking, you have a new generation of Democratic Party activists who are making a principle out of opposing Putin and Russia. So therefore, I don't think it's fleeting. There's a new generation of people. I was trying to cultivate them, recruit them for sanctions work, sort of get them excited about the possibilities of defending freedom. So I think it's possible. It won't happen by itself. Look, for the Georgians, the coalition to advance freedom was bipartisan. Clinton enlarged NATO with the help of Republicans like Randy Schuneman. Couldn't have done it without them. And Bush enlarged NATO with the help of Democrats like Ron Asmus. Couldn't have done it without him. It was a bipartisan left-right coalition. And we need to keep that together. And granted, some of the Democrats are using Russia to try to refight domestic politics. I get that. But there are some that are sincere, and I'll take them, I will embrace them, sort of recruit them to the cause, and with the Republicans and with the Democrats of the old guard, that's our coalition.
All right, we're going to open up a few questions from the audience, and in the middle and towards the back, we need a microphone. Way back. People, start walking. Okay. There you go. And please all introduce yourselves so that I don't screw up the
Thank you.
names.
Georgi Muchaidze, Atlantic Council. Well, maybe you are right now. Europe and Germany is convinced that Ukraine matters. And yet it can be a game changer. But they are still skeptical. Well, not all of them, but quite a number of them about Georgia. So if Ukraine does the thing, why should they care about Georgia? What will be your argument? Some of them think that it's not even in Europe. It could be, further aggravating Russia. So why not to be sufficient with supporting Ukraine? Why should they care about Georgia?
Okay, so here's my argument. It's called Why Georgia? Okay, why Georgia? The Baltic states were not really part of the Soviet Union. And when the Soviet Union fell, pre-World War II, Lithuania was still living memory. They had that to build on. But Georgia, like the other post-Soviet states, had no living memory of pre-revolutionary times. And therefore, the question has become, can any true post-Soviet country reach European standards? And there are some in the United States, the so-called realists, who believe that that is not possible, that no post-Soviet country, not Ukraine, not Georgia, not Russia, not anybody, will ever achieve European standards. And therefore, strategically, the West must end at the old Soviet border, with a grudging exception being made for the Baltics. That's the argument. Therefore, Georgia matters, because if you succeed in building a free market democracy at European standards, you will have proven that it is possible in post-Soviet conditions. You will prove that freedom can flourish here. And therefore, the Azerbaijanis and the Armenians and the Kyrgyz have no more damned excuses. Because their excuse is, hey, it's just too hard. We had all these years of communism. What do you expect? That is strategically important, not if we're merely defending freedom, but if we have the ambition to extend freedom, then Georgia becomes the example and the precedent. That's a pretty big argument. The other argument is the strategic one. We cannot allow Russian aggression to succeed anywhere. I'll take all the arguments I can get, but I wanted to suggest that the democracy argument, because that's the one with the potential for broadest appeal.
Okay, we have a question in the middle over here, a woman with blonde hair. Please stand up and they'll give you a microphone. There we go, in the orange, reddish top. Yes, thank you.
Thank you very much. One of the
Please
many...
introduce yourself.
I'm Tina Bakuchava. I'm from the United National Movement, opposition party in parliament. One of the many wisdoms that you have shared with us today, and thank you really for this very cogent and clear analysis that sometimes may seem quite evident, but I think a lot of us sometimes forget. So thank you again for those words. We really appreciate it. But one of them was that we must figure out a position of strength and that the time will come. As a representative of a pro-Western opposition, I think that that position of strength for Georgia, apart from the obvious economic success, is stronger democracy, is rule of law, is independent courts, is accountability to voters and the people rather than one party or one person rule, even worse. But unfortunately, I don't think the Georgian government a lot of times shares that understanding that I personally have, that that position of strength that we must garner and hold on to is necessarily those things that I've listed. Because as you said, time may come, but we have to be prepared for it. This, from my point of view, is the best way of preparation. What is it from your viewpoint? Thank you.
Well, first, Georgia needs to be aggressive at home, building its economy and its institutions, and not wait for anybody. Russia wants to be surrounded by weak states. It loves weak states on its borders, because the better to dominate them. I mean, why did Stalin prefer... no, I won't even go there. The Russians like weak states. We Americans like strong states. We want Mexico to be strong and successful, not weak and chaotic. A weak, chaotic Mexico does nothing for us. It's just trouble. A strong Mexico is what we want. Russia thinks the opposite with respect to its neighbors. I don't know enough about Georgian politics now. I mean, I knew about Georgian politics when your party was in power, and I remember, let's say, 2007. Okay? So I agree with every word you said about strong institutions, but that applies to everybody, and it applies to all parties. I hope Georgia works through the constitutional issues. As an American, I have very little to say by the way of a lecture about constitutional prerogatives and separation of powers, but then learn from what we're going through and don't go there. That's critical. Security starts with strong institutions. So I agree with you.
And let me just add a thought on this as well, which I want to recall the discussion with the president yesterday and other issues that have come up. Changing the Constitution in all of these ways is a big deal. Doesn't mean it's right or wrong. It just means it's a big deal. And so one of the goals that I think everyone should have is creating a greater sense of national unity and identity after that, so that Georgia emerges stronger rather than more divided. We have a question in the audience from Randy Schuneman, Orion Strategies, and then I'm going to bring it back and close it off. So thank you, Randy.
Dan, one more argument, and I know I'm simply reminding you, because you know it well, is that even the then Soviet Union, of which the Russian Federation is a successor state, signed the Helsinki Final Act, which gives, among other things, countries the right to choose their own alliances. And certainly Georgia should have that right, regardless of what the Russian Federation thinks. It's kind of a follow-up to Tina's point, drilling down a little bit on Georgia and the quality of the democracy. You know, when former Prime Minister Tymoshenko was imprisoned in Ukraine, all kinds of uproar happened in the United States, in Europe. I mean, the Germans actually considered canceling football matches with Ukraine. Former Georgian Prime Minister still sits in jail, arrested at a time when he likely would have been a presidential candidate. Former mayor of Tbilisi has been released, but others are in prison. The only reason Georgia now has joined with sanctions on Russia for its actions in Ukraine is because Ukrainian President Poroshenko has decided to pursue their vindictive policy against former President Saakashvili. I would submit there's some real problems here with vindictiveness towards the past regime that in some ways overshadows what should be a shared national interest in Euro-Atlantic integration. I wish, and I know Ambassador Kelly and Bridget are here, I wish the previous U.S. government had been more outspoken on these issues, and I wish the current U.S. government would take up those issues. Do you have a comment?
I've been absent from Georgia for a number of years, so I don't want to talk about the details of internal Georgian politics, but I will say this. Yesterday, during one of the discussions, one of our Georgian friends pointed out that during the Bush administration, we beat up Georgia pretty hard on democracy issues. And they understood that as a sign that we cared, which was exactly right. We need to hold them to the standards that they have themselves accepted. They want to be, they demand the rights that they are owed under the Helsinki Final Act, right about that, but they also demand the rights of a state with a European future. And so we should hold them to that. How you figure that out, the language you use publicly, you know, that's, Ian Kelly will figure that out. It's easier said than done. You know, easier for somebody me out of government, you know, to point, you know, to wag fingers. But I agree with you in principle. Pushing on democracy is a sign that we care. The Russians want Georgian democracy to fail. We want it to succeed. And we're look, Americans are completely indifferent to which party in Georgia is running things. We are not indifferent to constitutional processes, not because we care about form, but because a strong state, which is in our interests, requires strong independent institutions. I mean, that's why it's in our interest. So, yeah, I agree with you in principle about the importance of democracy.
And I'm motivated to make another comment, again, which is not Georgia specific. I just want to say it generally. in a situation where everybody is guilty of something, the choice of whom to prosecute is a political act. Now, the rule of law needs to be built, it just needs to be built carefully, so that the country, the state, the society emerges strong. That's true in a lot of places I can think of. I'm going to bring back one question to Dan, and then we'll wrap it up. You had a little discomfort earlier today listening to the glass half full arguments about the US and the West, because you were, I think, correctly identifying that the storm clouds that made this a question to begin with are still there.
Yeah.
Explain what you mean by that and what we should be watching out for.
Oh, boy. I was thinking about what the West got right and what we failed to get right after 1989. And I won't list it. We got NATO enlargement right. We partly failed with Russia, but we were recouping that. On security, we took down NATO strength too fast, too far, but we're making up for that. The big failure that we have not gotten right is internal. It is economic policy, where we have, in Europe, stagnation, and in the United States, wealth disparities, the Titanic effect. You know, first class in steerage. That's a problem, and that has undermined, at least in my country, political support for American internationalism. Trump, he may be a demagogue, but as a demagogue, he's pretty good at his job. He has identified the political weakness that has emerged as our economy has gotten out of whack, which is that Americans are not interested in our role in the world. They want things fixed at home. Now, it's true, as somebody said, that all presidents run a campaign on America at home, and then they govern as presidents responsible for the free world. I get that, but the problem is deeper. We need to get that right. We need to reframe the political argument so that Americans understand that the free world is in America's interests. We're not doing it because it's a charity. We're doing it because America cannot prosper unless other countries prosper also. And that argument has to be hammered home. And the Democrats are not very good at that. McCain is good at that. Now, there's some Democrats who are good at it, but Hillary Clinton never made that case. You know, not once. Joe Biden could. But the political class in America has lost that bubble. We've lost that. We've been losing the ability to make that argument, and that is critical. In the 90s, the Poles and the Balts, and the Hungarians too, in those years, helped the Clinton administration frame the case for NATO enlargement in terms of erasing the divisions of Europe and building a Europe that served American interests and everybody's interests. So, you know, Georgia, Ukraine, Lithuania, Poland, if they can remember what they ought to be doing, have a role to play, but that's a role for us Americans at home.
Yeah. Well, ladies and gentlemen, Dan Fried has done more for this part of the world than any other American diplomat. And we would love to have 3 or 4 Dan Frieds running around solving all our foreign policy problems. But I'm really grateful we have one. Thanks.
Thank you. Okay. Thanks for that.
All right, please stay in place. We're going to flip it to the panel and continue straight on.